Hello again. It's time to look at methods of weapon design in practice. To start, we'll need to establish what methods and what format we're going to use. For this example, let's use weapons as supplements as our method. And for our format, we'll be working with a tabletop role-playing game. Specifically, we'll be working with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. D&D is a very flexible system that can move between settings quite handily. It also has no explicit design rules, so we can make just about anything we want for it. When it comes to fitting into a specific method, D&D 5e is a very good example of something quite lightweight that goes along with the idea of weapons as modifiers more than anything. It can look like there's a lot of diversity in weapons, but upon close inspection, there really isn't. The only thing that separates a sickle and a whip in regard to the combat game loop is reach. On top of this, weapons in D&D have very few requirements, and the few requirements that are present are broad, sweeping ones that net many weapons rather than only a handful. But why use a tabletop role-playing game in the first place? Why not go straight into making our own Souls-inspired action RPG? Well, a paper prototype like this is a great opportunity to experiment and explore ideas in a way that doesn't risk sending our programmers off to make something that we might scrap. The programmers will need something to reference later anyways. We'll need to write something. So a tabletop role-playing game version of our later game is a fine idea. That and tabletop role-playing games are cool, and I don't have to code. So, where to start from here? Well, with some research, of course. For these examples, we'll be focusing on weapons as part of a narrative. So we'll be researching the when, where, and why of a setting to then design weapons around it. We'll need the following. 1. A time period or established setting. 2. To find out what weapons already existed in that time period or setting. And 3. The purpose of the weapons we find. For this example, we'll settle with classic high fantasy, but since D&D is a very flexible system, we can throw in a few other elements too. Since high fantasy is more of a statement about what creatures and technology exist in the world, we can also say it's gothic, with a bit of a darker tone and some early industrialization. As a result, we have a fair range of what we can explore in terms of weaponry. We can focus on weapons that did exist, or entirely fantastical tools that combine elements in a way that might not work in reality, like gunblades. For this example, let's settle with 2 ideas that can have 3 weapons built based on them, similar to how in D&D 5e there's the hand crossbow, light crossbow, and heavy crossbow. All are crossbows that use bolts and similar mechanics like loading, but have small, noticeable differences in damage and range, along with some other mechanics like weight. For this example, let's visit one of the most controversial concepts for Dungeons & Dragons, firearms. Specifically, we'll make some early flintlock firearms. These are somewhat unreliable guns with limited range but exceptional firepower. We can make 3 weapons based on this, a pistol, a rifle, and a middle ground between the two, a sort of carbine, or carbine. I don't know how to pronounce that. Anyways, for our second concept, let's do something a bit more fantastical, but still based in reality. One of the places that D&D 5e is missing entries is in the realm of hand-to-hand augments, bracers, gloves, brass knuckles, weapons that build on one's body, not add an extension to it. So let's make 3 weapons. A bracer covered in sharp claws, a massive spiked gauntlet, and a classic cestus, a sort of ancient-era boxing glove that has appeared quite a lot in From Software's RPGs. Both of these weapon ideas are wildly different from each other. Looking just at function, our firearms are used to attack at a distance, with penalties for getting too close. Meanwhile, our melee weapons require you to be right next to your opponent. In fact, their attacks count as unarmed strikes. The damage type of our fist weapons are also quite diverse, covering all physical damage types. Meanwhile, our ranged weapons deal mostly just 1. Now that we have some ideas, let's do some further concepting. I like to make written concepts first, which then influence the visual concepts. After you do this for a while, the process just kind of flows out of you. That's what happened for me. So this is more a recommendation for people who are newer to design. So I have a few recommendations for starting on this, and it's mostly an extension of the usual when, where, and why. First, what is the weapon meant to do? What purpose does it serve? Second, how is it able to do these things? Third, who uses such a weapon? Fourth, what is the weapon made of? And fifth, is it high-tech or low-tech? Answering these questions should give you a decent idea of what to do visually and possibly mechanically. For weapons as a side grade, you want to do this at least 3 to 4 times to make sure you have a good amount of variety. The next task is making sure that however many weapons you make, they are each different from one another. This is easily done by outlining what the weapons are like in a game sense. Start with one weapon and answer the following questions. First, how is it used? Second, is it melee or ranged? Third, high damage or low damage? Fourth, what sound does it make? Fifth, does it have long reach or short reach? Sixth, is it fast or slow? Seventh, does it use ammo? Eighth, is it exclusive or widespread? Ninth, does it cost anything to use? So there are a few small notes I have about these questions. To start, the way you'll want to use these is you outline these and then you start tweaking the values a bit so you can get other weapons by simply moving enough elements up and down that they play differently. That's how most games make their weapons. If you think about the difference between, let's say in Dark Souls 3, the longsword and broadsword, it's a difference in weapon length, base damage, some stat scaling, and attack animations. It's a fairly drastic change between the two, but it starts to get smaller the moment you factor in the short sword, and you see that there's more similarities to the short sword and long sword than there are to the short sword and broadsword. This is sort of what you'll want to do, even for tabletop role-playing games. Take a few elements and tweak them. Now to the questions. The first one, how is it used? That's more about things like attack animations, stances, skills, etc., etc. Whatever you might have that is weapon exclusive or weapon type exclusive. For weapon reach, remember that melee weapons can have reach too, particularly if you're working with weapons as archetypes or weapons as side grades. This is really important. So to add on a bit more, when you're thinking about things like cost and exclusivity, remember that there are certain traits that are also notable here more than just something like the rarity of the weapon. If a weapon is expensive, if the ammo it uses is expensive, if it's very heavy, these will be weapons that are used by a smaller number of people. If you can't afford the ammo you need to fire it, or if you can't lift the weapon, you're not going to have a bunch of people using it. You're going to have a much smaller user base. Think of the armor of Havel from the Dark Souls series. Not everybody can run around with a truck's worth of stone and steel on them. You'll want to design weapons and anything else with a similar mindset. There's more that creates exclusivity than just how easy it is to find the damn thing. The next step is artwork. The visual element is exceptionally important for engaging the player, particularly in tabletop role-playing games, which are often played without extensive simulations. In the end, a bad piece of art is still better than no art for these purposes, so take this time to make 1 to 3 concepts per entry. You want to make 4 to 6 concepts if you're working with the class/archetype idea of weapon design. From here on out, design changes between tabletop and video games. For video games, you want to look to sound design and VFX, which are both essential elements for creating juice to engage your players. This is something you should never skip out on, as these elements really create a realized experience for players. A game would feel hollow without them. Now, with all the concepts done, you can get into building things. You want to make sure you have an established format that is readable for players if you're making a TTRPG, or for your coders if you're making a video game. Clean code and writing goes a long way. Concise, modular, and clean coding makes it easier to add things in the future for video games, while strong, clear writing makes it easier for players to understand and minimizes the risk of situations where you need to explain yourself or plug loopholes and technicalities that bloat a system. Now would also be the time to finalize any artwork you may need, followed by sound and visual effects. When all of this is said and done, it's time to test. Ideally, this is also happening before even a final test of your game. You want to test small mechanics and systems as you work on them, not necessarily when the entirety of the game is done. Get the minimum you need and then get in there. What if we want to change the way weapons work in 5e to make them fit into the weapons as a side grade method or the weapons as an archetype method? It's quite possible, and it begins with not changing the weapons. What we do want to change is the way combat works in base 5e. Instead of a system that encourages relatively blind attacking, we want to make a system that encourages some thought ahead of time. We can form this into weapons as a side grade method by separating the specific sort of planning a player will need to do by weapon type. With this in mind, let's make base 5e support some special weapon skills, each with their own benefits and conditions for use. As a side note, this system is basically a light D&D compatible version of something I've been tinkering with for a while with my own tabletop role-playing game. I thought I'd just add that for the hell of it, and so you can know that there's a little bit of thought in this. Anyways, back to the system. To start, we'll want to modify 5e's rules to support the system we have in mind. We'll need to change the making an attack rule in 5e's combat section of the player handbook. For this, we need two addendums. First, the player needs to pick a skill. Second, the player needs to meet the requirements of their skill to attack. The requirements are really important here. Between the three methods of weapon designs I've outlined, the core gameplay loop changes by applying conditions to how the player can move, position themselves, and attack. So, we want to do the same, to make the player think a bit before they act. This really begins with applying conditions to how they attack, almost like making D&D into chess. But we don't want weapons to become gimmicky. We'll need to give every weapon a few options, each with their own advantages, disadvantages, and conditions. Our conditions can't be of little consequence or easy to achieve. They need to make the player change the way they engage with the game. From our video game examples from the last video, attack animations contribute to these elements. We aren't going to animate D&D, but we can use some of the components of attack animations here to make this possible, namely timing, placement, and reach. Timing can be hard, but placement and reach are very possible. They have existing elements in base 5e in the form of the reach weapon attribute and, of course, movement. Let's make some skills then. I've made 4 groups of skills, one for each of 4 weapon types I've gathered. 2 of these weapon types are the ones I've made, the bracers and flintlocks. The other 2 are groups made of base 5e weapons. First, there are the arming swords, which include the longsword and shortsword. And second, there are the bows, which include the longbow and shortbow. With these skills, I've provided each of them some special conditions. Some require the player be in cover, others require them move in a specific manner. The objective here is to make every skill demand the player think about what's going on for their use. In many cases, I use the rules of base 5e spells to make this possible. They're a great example of how base 5e gets the player to think a little about how they're employing their attacks, usually by making the player try and hit the most number of enemies or avoid hitting their allies, like Fireball. Not everything needs to be an area of effect attack though. For some of these, you can do perfectly well by just demanding the player be in a specific place or move in a specific way, like a chess piece. To ensure players have to think a lot, you may even want to modify or remove neutral options that don't strictly require a sort of movement or position like cover. Two skills for arming swords fit this description, and you can very well make the player think a bit more by slapping on some additional requirements or extending the reach of the existing AoE elements. That'll make the player think more about what they're doing. They'll have to avoid hitting their teammates or try to hit more enemies. In conclusion, designing is the first step of many that comes with creating weapons, and weapons are often the first step in getting players to engage with the world. After designing, there comes a long period of building: audio design, visual feedback and effects, modeling, animation, and artwork. There's a lot to tackle, which can often feel much more important than something like writing in concept art. However, during this time spent building a game, the work of a designer doesn't suddenly disappear. Instead, it persists and forms the backbone of the work being done. Design is important. My name is Theo Telega, and thank you very much for watching.